Zimbabwe is likely to abolish capital punishment, becoming the last country in the SADC region to do so. The country has attempted to do this, but the support for capital punishment by Zimbabwean citizens has made it challenging for the country's parliament. Though no prisoners have been executed since 2005, the international community is hailing this as a progressive step towards the protection of human rights and ridding the country of colonial practice. Well, we hear now more from Professor Frans Viljoen, Director of International Human Rights Law at the University of Pretoria. Prof, good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Your first reaction to the news that Zimbabwe is looking to go this direction.
Good morning, and thank you very much. Yes, I think just to say that, Zimbabwe is not the last in the Southern African development community. It is certainly an important player. There are a number of states that had not yet abolished, but we believe that, Zimbabwe, especially with its strong kind of consciousness of its anti-colonial history, the relatively recent colonial past, that if Zimbabwe abolishes totally the death penalty, that it could bring other states that are still not yet there also to the final act of abolishing.
So will help us with that clarity then, those states that still need to look to go towards that direction in your view?
Yes, I think that maybe just very briefly to say, if we look at states in terms of, abolishing or not the death penalty, one has to keep in mind that there really are like three categories, right? There are those states that abolish the death penalty in its totality for all crimes. South Africa obviously is one of those states, and Namibia, for example, would have been also doing that when it became independent. 25 out of the 55 African states at the moment have abolished the death penalty totally. The second category would be those states that abolish the death penalty for murder, which is the most, regular and usual offense to impose the death penalty for, but they retain it for a small number of exceptional offenses, such as for high treason. And Ghana is an example of that. They recently abolished the death penalty, but they kept it for high treason. And then you have those states that, have the death penalty for murder and other offenses. Zimbabwe falls in that category. But then you have to also consider whether the state actually executes people. And there we have two broad categories. Those states that have the death penalty still available may either actually execute people from time to time. Egypt is a very good example in the African context, and regrettably closer to home, Botswana. But then you have those states that are de facto in practice abolitionist. Although they can, from the legal point of view, impose, they do not in practice, and Zimbabwe falls in that category. Since 2005, as you said, more than 2 decades almost now, Zimbabwe has not executed anyone. And there are a number of other Southern African Development Community SADC states that fall in that category. For example, Eswatini, Lesotho, Malawi, all of them are not executing, but they have not gone so far as to officially abolish the death penalty. And that's where I think Zimbabwe can play a leading role.
Yeah, very interesting, though, that you see citizens in Zim in support of retaining the death penalty. I think that very, very fascinating. Now, compare it to what you see here in South Africa, where we've certainly abolished capital punishment, but many South Africans still feeling that this is the route today to go, rather, to deal with the high levels of crime. How do you explain that view from citizens?
Yeah, I think that, opinion polls have shown that, it's still a majority of people that say they support the retention of the death penalty, but something like 60%, which is relatively speaking a low figure. And I think the reason is that in Zimbabwe, there's a more recent consciousness of the way in which the death penalty had been abused and, used in a politicized way to target opponents of the colonial regime. We should remember that it wasn't so long ago that, there was unilateral declaration of independence with Ian Smith. And in that period, the death penalty was really used as an instrument of political oppression. So I think if citizens in Zimbabwe look at the death penalty today, they're still reminded that it really became part of the law, and it was used in the law in Zimbabwe to bolster a kind of a colonial imposition. And people then, to some extent, see it very deliberately as a colonial legacy. Therefore, there's more of a resistance to it. But just like in South Africa, there are also people who feel, well, there is also high levels of crime. So people still want to see the death penalty also come back. So there is contestation, but let me just say, of that 60% of people who said that they wanted the death penalty, 80% of those said that, but if the government actually will follow a policy of abolishing it, they will be okay with it. So the opposition to the death penalty is not very entrenched in Zimbabwe.
Yeah, I mean, 60% though saying they want to retain it is a considerable amount. And it has, I suppose, fears for political backlash for a ruling ZANU-PF, correct?
Yes, for sure. And the interesting thing is, President Mnangagwa personally is quite a big opponent of the death penalty. So you may know that, in the colonial time, he's actually accused of a bombing, and he was facing the death penalty himself. But because of his age, he was, given only a 10-year sentence. So he personally is driving, but he cannot be seen in the face of this popular opposition. So the way in which this was actually introduced in Parliament was by a so-called private member's bill from a member of the opposition. So, that also kind of absolves the majority party from saying, okay, we did not introduce this, we will support it, but they are now also in the process of undertaking consultations throughout the country. So that process is now actually being undergone.
So this I found quite fascinating, Prof, because you go further and you write about Shona cosmology and Kuripa Ngozi, and how that really is a big part of this, I suppose, the idea of abolishing capital punishment. Explain that for us, for those that don't, and many of us obviously not understanding Shona and Shona cosmology.
Yeah, maybe I don't understand it fully, but what I do understand is that there has, in the pre-colonial times, certainly not been an embrace of the death penalty in any of the cultures, especially not in the Shona culture. We see that there was much more emphasis on a restorative forms of justice. In other words, it's an exchange of people and goods to make good the harm that has been done to society, rather than a retributive, punishment and kind of the biblical idea. Those are much more recent importations and not part and parcel of the Shona traditional way of seeing life.
Yeah, I thought that was really, really quite fascinating, right? The idea of even the spiritual implications as is seen by the people of Zim, where that is concerned. The likelihood that we could see other nations then, even in the SADC region, perhaps right next to Zim, Botswana, for instance, see Zim take the step and think, okay, perhaps this is a way to go, especially in a country like Botswana, where they pride themselves on reasonably low levels of crime.
Yeah, Botswana is an interesting anomaly in the region. In fact, it's the only country in SADC that had consistently, in small numbers, have executed, people on death row. Yeah, I think it is bolstered not only by what Zimbabwe may do, but also, these states are all part of the African Union, and there is a drive. The African Union's Human Rights Commission, the Banjul Commission, has also indicated it has encouraged states to as far as they can, abolish the death penalty. Although it is not an explicit provision of the African Charter, the African Commission has increasingly put pressure on states to at least consider the abolition. So I think there are from various vantage points pressure on states, including on Botswana.
Yeah, another idea that you put forward, of course, is this. And it paints quite a picture. I think that many of us may not even think about it, that if you are on death row, there's the uncertainty as to when that is going to happen, right? When that capital punishment is essentially going to be handed down. And so people, I suppose, are living with that. And you write about living in uncertainty about their fate for prolonged periods. Prof.
Yes. Yes, thank you, Naledi. That is it's a kind of a scientific term that's used there, is the death row phenomenon. And it's been studied, across the world. And it has been understood to, in itself, constitute unusual or at least degrading inhuman treatment or punishment. Because, in most instances, people think the death penalty is a solution. But even if the death penalty is imposed, it is actually implemented in a very small proportion of cases. Even in countries where many people are sentenced, the number of people who are actually executed, because they are just sometimes not political will, there are many legal obstacles. And all that period of time, maybe 10 years, 20 years, could be longer, people live under that kind of a veil of uncertainty, right? It could happen they're not fully informed about all the complexities and the reasons why it may or may not be executed. So they live with that constant fear. And that death row phenomenon, even in Zimbabwe, courts have earlier already said that, the death row phenomenon itself constitutes a form of cruel and human degrading punishment.
Do we have do we have a number at this point about those that are living through that death row phenomenon, right? That uncertainty that's still coming within Zim? Do we have those numbers, Prof?
I mean, I don't have the exact numbers. I mean, we know that recently President Mnangagwa again commuted the sentence. So he a few years ago, he commuted the sentence of everyone that was sentenced, to life imprisonment. Yeah. So the last time, I think we know there were 63 people that were on death row that also got commuted. Yes. But the point is, the sentence is still being handed down by courts. Even today, tomorrow, the sentence could be handed down, even if in practice, there's no execution. So it's a small number. It's a small number. Because President Mnangagwa, because of his personal investment in this topic, as it were, he had consistently commuted at the political level the sentences.
Very, very interesting. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Prof. We really do appreciate your time. Professor Frans Viljoen, Director of International Human Rights Law at the University of Pretoria, speaking to us about how Zimbabwe is set to abolish the death penalty. Right.